And hopefully you won't be listening to the dogs, but I can't promise that. All right, I am going to begin. Augustine, The City of God Against the Pagans, which was edited by R.W. Dyson. And we are starting from the beginning now. We finished book 20. Now we're going to go all the way to book 1. Why not, huh? So, anyway, this is the preface. This translation has been made from the critical edition of B. Dombart and A. Kalb, published in the Corpus Christinorum series, 2 volumes, Turnabout 1955. Shh. Despite numerous and inevitable. Leave her alone, Charles. Shh. Come on. They're going to argue. I can't help it. They're going to argue. Despite numerous and inevitable misprints, this is the best available edition. I have also, from time to time, consulted the Corpus Scriptorum Ecclesiasticorum Latinorum edition of E. Hoffman, 2 volumes, Vienna, 1899 to 1900. In the view of the great length of the text and in keeping with the general principles of the series of which this translation is a part, footnotes have been kept to a minimum. For very extensive annotation, the reader is referred to the edition of J. E. C. Weldon. See bibliographical note. No abbreviations have been used which are not standard or self-explanatory. All right. Introduction. Saint Augustine. Augustine was born at Thagaste in the Roman province of Africa on 13 November 354. You heard that right. 354. To parents of senatorial rank. His mother, Monica, was a Christian. His father, Partisus, was not, although he was received into the church shortly before his death. Augustine was brought up as a Christian. Catechem, that's Catechumen. I'm not sure what that means. As was commonly the case in the 4th century, however, he was not baptized as a child. His childhood seems to have been full of unhappy experiences, especially in regard to his education. And it has a footnote that says, one can only with sadness note his rhetorical question at book 21:14. If anyone were offered the choice of suffering death or becoming a child again, who would not recoil from the second alternative and choose to die? That is very sad. He must have had a bad day. Okay. But he writes of his mother with great affection and is grieved by the memory of the pain which his youthful lapse caused her. In 370, he went to Carthage to study rhetoric. There he lost touch with Christianity and acquired a mistress who bore him a son called Adodatus. As everyone knows, he regards himself as having lived a deplorable life as a young man, although he does not seem to have done much that we should now regard as very shocking. He read Cicero's dialogue called Hornatus, now lost, an exhortation to philosophy, which fired his enthusiasm for learning. He was attracted successfully to Manichaeism, I can't say that word, I'm so sorry. Manichaeism, Scepticism, and Neoplatonism. He greatly admired the Ennads of Plotinus. Having taught for some years at Thagaste, Carthage, and Rome, he accepted a position as municipal professor of rhetoric at Milan in 384. He came under at 384, I'm sorry. At Milan, he came under the influence of Saint Ambrose, the bishop, and 2 Christian friends, Simplicinus and Pontitinus, after which, heart-searching, he was converted, perhaps one ought to say recalled to Christianity, and baptized by Saint Ambrose. in the year of 386. Returning to Africa, he founded a small religious fraternity at Thagasti, was ordained priest in 391, and became bishop of Hippo in 395. Hippo, or Hippo Regius, is modern Annaba in Algeria. In Augustine's day, it was a flourishing seaport, second in importance only to Carthage. In addition to his pastoral duties, Augustine was for the rest of his life engaged in controversy with the various heretics and schismatics who then troubled the church. He produced treatises against the Manichaeans, Arians, Pelagians, and Dantonists. He died at Hippo in 430 while the city was being besieged by the Vandals. His feast is celebrated on the day of his death, 28 August. His literary outpost, excluding all dubia and spuria, extends to 113 books and treatises, more than 200 letters, and over 500 sermons. Wow. Excuse me. The City of God. The City of God is universally regarded as Augustine's greatest work. He began it in 413 and worked at it sporadically over the next 13 years. As his episcopal duties and other literary projects allowed, publishing it in fascicules along the way, he tells us that someone was preparing a reply to the first 3 books, but no such answer has survived if it was ever written. The completed work appeared in 426. On Augustine's own account, Retractions, and I don't know what this is, it has a 2 and then a big 43 and then a 2. It was after the sack of Rome in 410 by Alaric and the Visigoths that he resolved to write the City of God, in rebuttal of those who then began to blaspheme against the true God more ferociously and bitterly than before. Rome does not, in fact, seem to have suffered much damage during Alaric's 3-day sack, and as Augustine at pains to point out, her attackers, who were Christians, albeit Arians, were remarkably restrained in their treatment of the populace. But the Romans had become accustomed to thinking of their city and empire as eternal. As one might expect, the psychological impact of the sack was considerable, and only 26 years previously, by this edict, Constantio Papalos of 384, Emperor Theodosius had abolished the worship of Rome's ancient gods and established Christianity as the official religion of the empire. Numerous anti-pagan edicts had followed. Not surprisingly, a certain current or largely aristocratic opinion in the Roman world attributed the events of 410 to this change of allegiance. Rome is now suffering, it was thought, because she has forsaken the gods of her fathers in favor of a God who counsels meekness and submission. Augustine's original intention then was to answer the charge that Christianity was responsible for bringing about the sack of Rome. Those parts of the City of God, Book 1 through 10, which are largely devoted to this task, are easy to summarize. Rome's misfortune are not due to the upcoming of Christianity. She suffered numerous calamities and reversals before Christ was born. Her gods did not protect her then, and they are not protected her now, and have not protected her now, because they cannot protect her. They are futile non-entities. They are, moreover, evil demons who love to lead men into error. This is shown by the fact that they wish to be worshipped by means of obscene theatrical displays and other degrading performances. All attempts, even by authors as formidable as Varro, to construct a respectable theology out of the farrago of myth and superstition, which constitutes popular religion, end only in contradiction and nonsense. But the City of God rapidly acquired a broader purpose than this original one. In 412, presumably while he was planning the City of God according to his initial conception of it, Augustine received a letter from a friend and fellow Christian called Marcellinus. Marcellinus was a Roman civil servant, deputed by the emperor to the delicate and thankless task of trying to resolve the dispute between the Catholics and the Donatites. Donatites? In his letter, he set out certain difficulties which he had come across during his discussions with the educated pagans, and in particular with Valacinus, the emperor proconsul of Africa. Why are the miracles of Christianity regarded as anything special? Question mark. Paganism has many miracles to boast of, some of them most spectacular than the miracles of Christ. If God was pleased with the sacrifices offered to him by the people of the Old Testament, and if he is immutable, why is he not pleased with such sacrifices now? Question mark. What good has Christianity brought to Rome? Question mark. Is it not true that ever since the old religion was abandoned and Christianity taken up, the political and military fortunes of the empire have gone from bad to worse? Question mark. Augustine gives a provisional answer to these difficulties in two letters, Epistle 137 and 138, in which he sketches several of the themes later developed in the City of God. At the end of Epistle 138, he promises to deal with these matters more fully in a further letter or in a book. This is the promise referred to at Book 1 of the City of God, and of which the City of God itself is the fulfillment. We may notice in passing, however, that Augustine mentions the possibility of writing a book about the two cities, in quotation marks, brought into being by the fall of the angels in his De Genesi ad Litterium, written between 402 and 413. Also, as early as 405 in his work called De Catazenes Rudibus, he speaks of two cities, one of the wicked, the other of the holy, which endure from the birth of the human race to the end of time. It is reasonable to conjecture that a city of God in some form or other would have been written even had the sack of Rome not occurred, even without the correspondence with Marcellinus. In a letter written to an African Christian called Firmus, to whom he was sending a copy of the work, Augustine says, there are 22 sections, too many to bring together into one volume. If you wish to make 2 volumes, you should divide them in such a way that there are 10 books in the first and 12 in the second. If you wish to have more than 2, you should make 5 volumes. Let the first contain the first 5 books, in which I write against those who claim that the worship of the gods, small g, or, as I should rather say, evil spirits, leads to happiness in this life. Let the second volume contain the next 5 books written against those who think that such deities are to be worshipped by rites and sacrifices in order to secure happiness in the world to come. Let the 3 following volumes contain 4 books each. I have arranged this part of the work in such a way that 4 books describe the origin of the city, 4 its progress, or rather its development, and the final 4 for the ends which await it. Wow. Pretty groovy, huh? Okay. This division into sections of so highly discursive a work is inevitably rather inexact, but it is useful as a broad description. The chapters' headings, which appear in this translation, may be by Augustine himself, although they are more probably the addition of subsequent editors. Partly, no doubt, because of the episodic nature of its composition, but partly also thanks to Augustine's habitual peculiarities of style. The City of God is not an easy book to read. Augustine is addicted to long and involved sentences. Sometimes he gets lost in them himself. He is much given to repetition, the pursuit of lengthy digressions, and to laboring a point. He is capable of great obscurity and tedium. Some of his arrangements are weak, tenacious, and unfair. Peter Brown, one of Augustine's most distinguished modern biographers, gives a summary of the character of the work as a whole, which the reader may think more charitable than it deserves. Even Augustine thought it a bit too long, and we tend to dismiss it, as Henry James dismissed the Russian novels of the last century as the loose, baggy monster. Above all, De Civitate Dea is a book of controversy. It should never be treated as though it was a static, complete photograph of Augustine's thought. It reads like a film of a professional boxing championship. It is all movement, ducking, and weaving. Augustine is a really stylish professional. He rarely relies on the knockout. He is out to win the fight on points. It is a fight carried on in 22 books against nothing less than the whole pagan literary culture available to him. Wow. And then there's a 4 down here. Let's see. It says Augustine gives a shorter but broadly similar description at Retract for partial description in the City of God itself. St. Augustine in Barrow Smalley, Trends in Medieval Political Thought, Oxford, 1965. I'm so sorry. Nor by the same token is the City of God an easy book to translate. Some of Augustine's past translators have, it must be said, yielded to the temptation to improve on the original, either in the interest of some religious preference of their own or in order to make difficult passages or arguments seem clearer. In translating the City of God, I have followed the straightforward principle that the only task of the translator is to translate. I have, in other words, tried to give as ferocious a rendering, and I don't think that's ferocious, veracious, a rendering of Augustine's Latin as possible, including his many awkwardness and obscurities. Where necessary, I have sacrificed elegance to accuracy, and I have not tried to mistigate the fact that some parts of what he says, particularly when engaged in scriptural commentary and interpretation, are difficult to make sense of. I have sometimes had to translate more freely than I should wish, simply in the interest of intelligibility. Where it has been possible to give a literal translation, I have, at any rate, tried to convey the meaning and flavor of Augustine's text as faithfully as I could. If this translation contains difficulties, this is because those difficulties appear in the original. I have tried to remain as independent as possible of the previous translators whose versions I have consulted, although it goes without saying that I am greatly indebted to them. Augustine's political thought. At first glance, it may seem to the reader odd that this enormous work, so full of biblical exegesis and defunct theology or theological controversies, should excite the interest of historians of political thought to the extent that it does. Despite the apparent belief of some authors to the contrary, Augustine does not offer a theory or philosophy of history or politics. The City of God is not and is not intended to be a treatise, systematic or otherwise, of political thought. There is no discussion in it of the merits or demerits of the different forms of government. There is no sustained attempts to recommend an ideal or a best possible state. Here, as in Augustine's other mature writings, all else is auxiliary to his theological purpose. Insofar as the elements of Augustine's political, social, and historical thought are represented in the City of God, they are present, if one may express it, in much the way that the fragments of a pot might be present at an archaeological site. They have to be identified, sorted out from large masses of other material, and assembled. When this process is complete, however, the resilient picture is a relatively clear one, in its broad outlines at any rate, though there is a good deal of room for disagreement and debate over matters of detail. Down here, footnote, the picture becomes a good deal more detailed and informative, of course, when the City of God is read in conjunction with the numerous other political passages that are scattered throughout Augustine's work. Paulucci anthology and the numerous quotations and references given by H.A. Dean may be consulted. All right. In the following paragraphs, I shall give as complete a summary as I can. The reader should bear in mind, though, that for some reason, I said that wrong, I'm so sorry. The reader should bear in mind, though, that for reasons of space, I shall have to prescind altogether from discussion of critical and interpretational difficulties. Augustine's social and political thinking depends most fundamentally upon his understanding, meditated through St. Paul, of the biblical narrative of the fall. When God created Adam and Eve and placed them in paradise, their life was originally one of untrammeled joy. The love of the pair for God and for one another was undisturbed, and they lived in a faithful and sincere fellowship which brought great gladness to them, for what they loved was always at hand for their enjoyment. There was a tranquil avoidance of sin, and as long as this continued, no evil of any kind intruded from any source to make them sadness. Our first parents were subject to one prohibition only, that they should not eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Had they not sinned, their happy life would have continued forever. They would have produced others of their own kind without the shame of lust or the pangs of childbirth. They would have known no sickness or misfortune, and men would have made the transition from earth to heaven without pain and death. But man was created with free will, made by God out of nothing, and therefore lacking the supreme perfection of being that only he possesses. It was possible for the first human beings to fall away from him through sin, that is, through the free choice of wrongdoing. The serpent, envious of man's unfallen state, beguiled Eve, and she led her husband into transgression with her. Their sin consisted in placing their own wishes before the ordinance of God, in allowing their actions to be directed by pride and self-love rather than by the love of God. Let no one think that hell is too severe a penalty for the original sin. The sin of the first human beings was all the more dreadful because so little had been asked of them. The unrighteousness of disobeying the command was all the greater in proportion to the ease with which it could have been observed and upheld. Yeah, that's truth. As their own punishment, Adam and Eve were immediately expelled from paradise and made subject to pain, death, and damnation. But as well as their own punishment, their sin has consequences for their offspring also, consequently which determine the whole subsequent course of human history. So great was the sin of those two that human nature was changed by it for the worst, and so bondage to sin and the necessity of death were transmitted to their posterity. Because Adam and Eve abused it, the free will with which mankind was created has been lost, not by Adam and Eve merely, but by every single member of the human race whose first parents they are. The choice of the will, then, is truly free only when it is not the slave of vices and sins. God gave to the will such freedom, and now that it has been lost through its own fault, it cannot be restored save by him who could bestow it. Created to love God, man, by succumbing to the person of his first parent, to self-love when he had a choice, has lost the capacity to choose, or at least he can now choose only in the sense of selecting which of the many unavailable sins actually to commit. He has become so dominated by self-love that, unless he is aided by the unmerited gift of God's grace, it is now not possible for him to do anything except sin. That is, to live, as Augustine habitually puts it, according to man rather than according to God. Because of the original sin, then, each one of us comes into the world worthy of damnation, subject to the necessity of death. This, to Augustine's mind, is the dominant fact of our individual and social existence. He does not really explain to us why or how the original sin has such consequences for all mankind, rather than merely for those who committed it, and he does not discuss the obvious difficulties which his view encounters. God's dispensation is hidden from us, but we are not entitled to question its fairness. It is, he considers, a matter of faith that the subsequent condition, moral, social, and political, of mankind has been determined by the sin of our first parents. It is not insignificant that the first city was founded by Cain, the fraternal son of Adam. It is clearly Augustine's view. Had the fall not occurred, the state and the various devices of coercion, punishment, and oppression which we associate with the state would not have come into existence. They would not have come into existence simply because there would have been no need for them. Man is naturally sociable, but he is not naturally political. Living with a rightly ordered love and therefore a good will, loving God above all and neighbor as self, men would have been able to dwell with one another in spontaneous peace and cooperation. It was God's original intention that men were to be equal and ungoverned save by himself. They were given dominion over the beast, but no man was given dominion over any other. He did not intend that his rational creatures, made in his own image, should have lordship over any, but irrational creatures, not man over man, but the man over the beast. Hence the first just men were established as shepherds over flocks, rather than as kings of men. Fallen man, however, because governed by self-love, is constantly subject to destructive emotions and impulses. He is envious and vindictive. He loves glory. He desires material riches. He is consumed by what Augustine calls libido dominati, the lust for mastery, the desire to dominate others. This desire, Augustine says elsewhere, arises out of an intolerable pride which refuses to accept that all men are by nature equal. To a considerable extent, the state is an expression of these base impulses. It arose out of man's lust for power and violence. Most of its wars occur because of these things, although Augustine does acknowledge the possibility of a just war. And it has always existed largely to acquire and preserve those things which man desires only because he is greedy and sinful. In this state, the state is a consequence of sin and an occasion for sin. It is not, as for Plato and Aristotle, a natural part of human life or a natural expression of human capacities. On the contrary, it is for Augustine an unnatural supervention brought into being by the fact that man's naturally sociable nature has been vitiated and made selfish by sin. Even at its best, the state is a sort of fear, pain, and death. Even good judges, because they cannot know men's hearts, have to resort to torture in order to get at the truth. Even they make mistakes and sometimes condemn the innocent or let the guilty go free. The wise judge can only pray to be delivered from his responsibilities. The fall of man did not, as it were, come as a surprise to God. God does not exist within and is not bound by time. He contemplates the whole of eternity in one single glance. Nothing is unknown to him, therefore, because nothing is future or past to God. Nothing is unforeseen or forgotten by him, and nothing can take him unawares. Thus, he knew from all eternity that man would sin, and that being thereby made subject to death himself, would propagate men doomed to die. In his mercy, however, he also resolved from all eternity to rescue some few men, only a few, Augustine thinks, from the general wreck. He has predestined some members of the human race to salvation in spite of sin. And these elect, these chosen ones, are members of what Augustine calls the city of God. They are those whose vitiated wills are repaired by God's grace, who are therefore able to escape the bondage of self-love, to love God as they should, and therefore to merit salvation. By contrast, those upon whom God has not chosen to bestow his grace are members of the earthly city, the Civitas Terrena. The Civitia Terrena is the city of the lost, whose allotted end is eternal damnation. Sometimes Augustine calls it the Civitia Diabolo, Diabololi or something like that. Um, Augustine speaks of these two cities or communities as deriving their respective identities, their cohesion from their members, allegiance to a common object of love. This idea of love as a unifying force is very characteristic of Augustine. In a general sense, he describes a populace, a people, not in terms of race or language, but as an assembled multitude of rational creatures bound together by a common agreement as to the objects of their love, from which it follows, he says, that if we are to discover the character of any people, we have only to examine what it loves. As to the two cities, he says, certainly this is the great difference that distinguishes the two cities of which we are speaking. The one is a fellowship of godly men, and the other of ungodly, and each has its own angels belonging to it. In the one city, love of God has been given pride of place, and in the other, love of self, somewhat latter in the same book, Augustine says. Let me reread that. In the one city, love of God has been given pride of place, and in the other, love of self. Somewhat later in the same book, Augustine says, two cities, then, have been created by two loves, that is, the earthly, by love of self extending even to contempt of God, and the heavenly, by love of God extending to contempt of self. The one, therefore, glories in itself, the other in the Lord. The one seeks glory from men, the other finds its highest glory in God, the witness of our conscience. The one lifts up its head in its own glory. The other says to its God, Thou art my glory and the lifter of mine head. Psalm 3:3. It is important to be clear at this point, however, that Augustine's city of God, a fellowship of godly men, is not simply coexistive with or a synonym for synonym, how do you say that word? synonym for the institutional or earthly church. Certainly, Augustine's language is not without ambiguity here. Indeed, he is materially inconsistent in this regard, and a number of his medieval admirers, misunderstanding him, or perhaps they deliberately exploited his inconsistencies, were apt to treat civitas Dea and civitas terrena simply as alternative terms for the earthly embodiments of spiritual and secular power. Broadly speaking, however, Augustine's preferred meaning of the term is not in doubt. The city of God is, as it were, a community which transcends space and time. The elect who are at present alive on earth form only a small part of its citizen body. It consists also of those angels who remain loyal to God and the souls of the elect who have died and are now in heaven with him. Those members of the city of God who are at any time alive on earth, Augustine refers to collectively as the Civita Dea Peregrina, the city of God on pilgrimage. Augustine's city of God, we might say, is what is usually meant by the communion of saints. Similar remarks apply to the Civita Terrena. It is very clearly exemplified in the great pagan states of antiquity, Babylon, Assyria, and pagan Roman Empire. But again, despite fairly frequent ambiguities of language, it is not any one of these states, nor all of them taken together. Those of the lost or reprobate who are at present alive on earth form part of its membership, but it also includes the souls of the damned who have died and who are now suffering in hell. And its founder members, so to speak, are the apostate angels who, in their pride, fell away from God. The two cities are invisible communities whose duration is coextensive with the history of the world. It should be noted also that many who might seem to be among the saved are not. Many people who are outwardly members of the institutional church are, in fact, citizens of the earthly city. While she is a pilgrim in this world, the city of God has with her, bound to her by the communion of the sacraments, some who will not be with her to share externally in the bliss of the saints. Some of these are concealed. Some of them, however, join openly with our enemies and do not hesitate to murmur against the God whose sacraments they bear. Sometimes they crowd into the theaters with our enemies, and sometimes into the churches with us. In this wicked world and in these evil days, many reprobate are mingled in the church with the good. Both are, as it were, collected in the net of the gospel. And in this world, as in a sea, both swim together without separation, enclosed in the net until brought to shore. Wow. And he's written this in the 400s. And we're in 2026, and the same thing's happening. This is crazy. Okay. It is not correspondingly true, however, that every member of the city of God is also a member of the institutional church. The righteous man of the Old Testament who lived before there was a church in the narrow institutional sense are members of the city of God. Augustine even suggests at one point that the Erythraean or community, I can't say that word, Cumaean, Sybil, is a member because she spoke out forcibly against the worship of false gods. So far as the earthly contingents of the two cities are concerned, we cannot tell by any outward appearance who belongs to which. For the time being, the two cities are mingled together in this world, sharing its resources and sharing its tribulation also. For God causes his rain to fall upon good and evil men alike. They will only be visibly divided at the end of history, when Christ will come to judge the living and the dead. Then the sheep will be separated from the goats, and the two cities will each go away to its appointed end, to the end to which there shall be no end. Augustine's doctrine of the two cities is intimately associated with a Christian perception. It is not in any defensible sense a philosophy of history. Human history, properly conceived, is not the history of Livy, but the history of the Bible. It is not a certain philosophers think. It is not as certain. That doesn't make sense to me. It is not, as certain philosophers think, an endless repetition of the same cycle of creation and destruction, nor is it the history of the glorious exploits of Rome or of any other empire. It is the gradual unfolding of the respective destinies of the two cities in a linear progression from the beginning of history to its end. History is not working towards some end or culmination in this world. The true destiny of mankind, whether it be damnation or salvation, does not lie within, but beyond history. For Augustine, then, membership of the state cannot have the ethical significance attributed to it by Plato and Aristotle. The state, that is, cannot be the matrix within which man, made wise by education and practice, can achieve his distinctive good or end by making rational choices and participating in the common life. Man's final good simply does not lie and cannot be achieved in this life. Moreover, it is only by the grace of God given to some men by God simply as an undeserved gift that man is enabled to live well even in a restricted sense of the word. Without the grace of God, man is, from the point of view of morality or intentionality, completely helpless. He cannot by his own effort achieve any good whatsoever, whether by political participation or by any other kind of social or political engagement. By his own effort, indeed, he cannot achieve anything which is not sinful. Even those heroes of Rome's past who have shown the most exemplary courage have done so either out of the selfish desires for glory or out of misguided loyalty to God, small g, or institutions, which are not worthy objects of devotion. It is only his membership of the city of God or the earthly city which has reference to the ethical good of the individual. There is no one who does not belong to one or the other of these cities. But these cities, as we have seen, are not confined to any particular place or any particular time, nor, strictly speaking, can anyone be said to participate in them. Their members are not citizens in a way that would have made sense to Aristotle. They are the communities of the elect and reprobate, respectively, bound together by their members' common love, whether of God or self. In this context, we may note Augustine's well-known rebuttal of the traditional claim of the Roman state to be the special embodiment of justice. He sets out to show that this claim is evasive by way of his critique. Begun at 1121 and resumed several years later. I don't know what that means right there. The 1121 must be a book that he had written of Cicero's discussion of the Roman Commonwealth in his dialogue De Republica. As part of this discussion, Cicero says or causes Scipio Africanus Minor to say that justice is part of the very essence of a commonwealth, that a commonwealth cannot even exist unless justice is present. But on this showing, Augustine observes, Rome herself never was a commonwealth. That is, according to Scipio's own definition, a moral community consisting not of a mere multitude, but of a populace, a people, united in fellowship by common agreement as to what is right, and by a community of interest, what is justice. Augustine adopts the classical commonplace that justice is that virtue which gives to each his due, but he says, introducing a shift in the meaning of justice that can hardly be regarded as fair. Rome never extended to the true God the worship which he is due. What kind of justice is it, then, that takes a man away from the true God and subjects him to impure demons? Is this giving to each his due? Or are we to call a man unjust if he takes a piece of property away from one who has bought it and hands it over to someone who has no right to it? Yet just if he takes himself away from the lordship of the God who made him and serves evil spirits. Here, then, is not the common agreement as to what is right, by which a multitude is made into a people whose property a commonwealth is said to be. And what is true of pagan Rome is true by implication of all pagan states. Those who do not worship the true God cannot be just men. A multitude of such men cannot be a populace in the required sense. And such a multitude therefore cannot form a state which is stricto sensu just, which is, in short, a res publica, a commonwealth. To the extent that they make a relatively safe and orderly life possible for their subjects, pagan states can achieve a semblance of justice, so to speak, in a loose or incomplete sense of the term. There was, of course, according to a more practicable definition, a commonwealth of a sort, and it was certainly better administered by the Romans of more ancient times than by those who have come after them. But this is not true justice, for true justice does not exist other than in that commonwealth whose founder and ruler is Christ. True justice can exist only among the citizens of the city of God, and will be fully realized only after this world ends, when the city of God, purged of all impure elements, will finally enjoy God for eternity. These remarks may be taken in conjunction with Augustine's pronouncement, where he makes use of the familiar story of Alexander and the pirate, a story probably known to him in the version given in Book 3 of Cicero De Republica. Justice removed, then, what are kingdoms but great bands of robbers? What are bands of robbers themselves but little kingdoms? Without justice, Augustine says, and presumably he intends this statement to apply to all pagan states, the state differs from a band of robbers only in point of size and immunity from consequences. He suggests, indeed, that a state might actually originate in a gang of bandits, if, by the constant addition of desperate men, this scourge grows to such a size that it acquires territory, establishes a seat of government, occupies cities, and subjugates peoples. It assumes the name of kingdom more openly. For this time is now manifestly conferred upon it, not by the removal of greed, but by the addition of impunity. Augustine possibly has in mind here the story to which he refers of how Romulus originally peopled Rome by offering sanctuary to criminals. More than 600 years later, writing to Bishop Herman of Metz, Pope Gregory VII, in a conscious or unconscious paraphrase, says, "Who does not know that kings and princes derive their origin from men ignorant of God, who, at the instigation of the devil, the prince of this world, raise themselves up above their fellows by pride, plunder, treachery, murder, and every kind of crime." Wow. At its worst, then, the state is the institutionalism. Oh, I'm not saying that right. Institutionalization of man's most characteristic and destructive weaknesses: greed, vanity, the lust for power, possession, and glory. Even at its best, the pagan state cannot be a commonwealth, a moral community, properly so called. It can achieve only a semblance of justice, a justice which consists not in the absence but in the mere suppression of discord. None of this, however, is to imply that, strictly speaking, Augustine is hostile to the state or opposed to it. In this regard, we may make 4 points. First, as an important point of his political thinking, Augustine acknowledges that even pagan states have an indispensable part to play in securing the peace and order which all men want, the peace for the sake of which even wars are waged, and without which even robbers cannot live. Certainly, this peace is not true peace. True peace, like true justice, exists only in heaven, when all the antagonisms associated with life in a fallen world have ceased. Moreover, it is only a transient, an unstable kind of peace. I think that's what it is, achieved and maintained by violence and fear, and often desired only so that ignoble ends may be pursued without interruption. But it is nonetheless peace of a kind, and as such is a kind of good. It brings back a measure of order to a world disordered by sin. In this sense, the state may be regarded not only as a consequence of and punishment for sin, but as a remedy, a means of restraining and controlling the disruptive aspects of human behavior, which are the result of sin. As such, it brings benefit to Christians and non-Christians alike, for while the two cities are intermingled, we also make use of the peace of Babylon. Second, despite its association with man's fallen condition, the state has not come into being against the wishes of God, as it were. On the contrary, its existence is in accordance with his wishes at his command. The state has its place in the divine will and plan, foreknown, foreordained, and with its own proper purpose, voicing what was to become a commonplace of medieval political thought, although not oddly enough quoting the famous dictum of St. Paul at Rome. Augustine insists that all power comes from God, whether conferred upon good rulers or bad. He gives happiness in the kingdom of heaven only to the godly. Earthly kingdoms, however, he gives to the godly and ungodly alike, as it may please him, whose good pleasure is never unjust. He who gave power to the Christian Constantine also gave it to the apostate Julian. Wicked rulers are instruments of God's punishment. The Emperor Nero, for example, was a ruler noted by abominable cruelty and wickedness, but the power of lordship is given even to such men as is only by the providence of the supreme God, when he judges that the condition of human affairs is deserving of such lords. Whoa. That's why we got Trump in office, huh? Oh my. The divine voice is clear on this matter, for the wisdom of God speaks as follows: "By me kings reign, and tyrants possess the land." We may notice in passing here, however, that Augustine consistently fails to make the rather obvious distinction between the divine authority of the institution of government and the divine authority of the individual ruler. This omission was to have a significant bearing upon medieval discussions of whether or not an unjust ruler may be resisted. Third, Augustine is certainly not without admiration for the deeds and fortitude of the heroes celebrated in the history of Rome: Marcus Regulus, Gaius Mucius Scaevola, the DC, Curtius, and the rest. Misguided as they were in what they desired and loved, These are men who, in some ways, are a salutary example to the Christian. Indeed, he suggests that God has allowed the Roman state to achieve greatness precisely in order to furnish us with such an example. Thus, when illustrious kingdoms had long existed in the East, God willed that there should arise in the West an empire which, though later in time, should be more illustrious still in the breadth and greatness of its sway. And in order that it might overcome the grave evils which had afflicted many other nations, he granted it to men who, for the sake of honor and praise and glory, so devoted themselves to their fatherland that they did not hesitate to place its safety before their own, even though they sought glory for themselves through it. Moreover, it was not only for the sake of rendering due reward to the citizens of Rome that her empire and glory were so greatly extended in the sight of men. This was done also for the advantage of the citizens of the eternal city during their pilgrimage here. It was done so that they might diligently and soberly contemplate such examples, and so see how great a love they owe to their supernal fatherland for the sake of life eternal, if an earthly city was so greatly loved by its citizens for the sake of merely human glory. Nor is Augustine without admiration for the intellectual achievements fostered by the culture of the pagan state. He speaks with consistent respect of Plato, Varro, Plotinus, and Porphyry. I can't say the word. His own philosophical range is somewhat restricted by his lack of all but a smattering of Greek. He seems, for example, to have first-hand knowledge of only the Meno and Timaeus of Plato and Latin translations. But it is clear that he cannot entirely shake off his respect for the accomplishments insofar as he understands them, even of those whom he wishes to oppose. Fourth, and predictably enough, Augustine considers that, in contrast to the radical injustice of the pagan state, the specifically Christian state comes as close to accomplishing justice as it is possible to come on earth. If he says, and then it says, quoting Psalm 148:11, I think that is, the kings of the earth and all nations, princes and all judges of the earth, young men and maidens, old men and children, people of every age and each sex, if those to whom John the Baptist spoke, even the tax gatherers and the soldiers, if all these together were to hear and embrace the Christian precepts of justice and moral virtue, then would the commonwealth adorn in its lands with happiness in this present life and ascend to the summit of life eternal, there to reign in utmost blessedness. The Christian state, imperfect though it inevitably is, can nonetheless provide a milieu within which the church can do her work effectively and the Christian life can be lived by its citizens. The Christian ruler can, in his own person, furnish his subjects with an example of piety and humility. Augustine gives a description in Nous of the life and task of the Christian emperor. For we do not say that certain Christian emperors were happy because they ruled for a longer time, or because they died in peace and left behind sons to rule as emperors, or because they subdued the enemies of the commonwealth, or because they were able to avoid and suppress uprisings against them by hostile citizens. For even certain worshippers of demons, who do not belong to the kingdom of God to which these emperors belong, have deserved to receive these and other gifts and consolations of this wretched life, and this is to be attributed to his mercy, who does not wish those who believe in him to desire such things as their highest good. Rather, we say that they are happy if they rule justly, if they are not lifted up by the talk of those who accord them sublime honors or pay their respects with an excessive humility. But remember that they are only men if they make their power the handmaid of his majesty by using it to spread his worship to the greatest possible extent, if they fear, love, and worship God, if they love that kingdom which they are not afraid to share with others more than their own, if they are slow to punish and swift to pardon, if they resort to punishment only when it is necessary to the government and defense of the commonwealth, and never to gratify their own enmity, if they grant pardon, not so that unjust men may enjoy impunity, but in the hope of bringing about their correction, if they compensate for whatever severe measures they may be forced to decree with the gentleness of mercy and the generosity of benevolence, if their own self-indulgence is as much restrained as it might have been unchecked, if they prefer to govern wicked desires more than any people whatsoever, if they do all these things, not out of craving for empty glory, but from love of eternal felicity, and if they, for their sins, they do not neglect to offer to their true God the sacrifices of humility and contrition and prayer, we say that, for the time being, such Christian emperors are happy in hope, and that in time to come, when that to which we now look forward has arrived, they will be so in possession. This Speculum Principus was to have many imitators in the centuries to come. Reading it, one is inevitably struck by the words, if they make their power the handmaid of His Majesty by using it to spread His worship to the greatest possible extent. 2 chapters later in the same book, Augustine refers approvingly to Emperor Theodosius' famous submission to the authority of Bishop Ambrose of Milan in 390. And in the same place, he congratulates that emperor on his readiness to assist the church in her labors against the ungodly by means of the most just and merciful laws. Also, we know from Augustine's letters on the subject that, despite initial misgivings, he came eventually to feel that the church may and should call upon the secular magistrate to aid her in her struggles against heretics and schismatics. Certainly, it would be a major error of interpretation to suppose that in the city of God or anywhere else, Augustine offers a theory of church and state, or regnum and sacerdotium, or that he suggests in any definite sense that the secular authorities are subordinate to, or the servants of the church. There is no doubt, however, that in the city of God and elsewhere he does present us with some of the components of such a theory. Augustine's political thought cannot be called systematic. Arguably, indeed, it is rather misleading to synthesize his more or less scattered remarks into a continuous narrative. In fact, he does not really regard political relationships or doctrines as having any particular importance, considered merely as such. After all, he says, what difference does it make under what rule a man lives who is soon to die, provided only that those who rule him do not compel him to do what is impious and wicked? It is largely because his political thought developed in so ad hoc a fashion and is expressed so incidentally that it is so notoriously full of inconsistency and ambiguity. Having said this, however, we may identify at least 3 important respects in which he is of enduring interest to the historian of political thought. First, Augustine confronts more fully than any of his Christian predecessors the ethical and political doctrines and assumptions of classical philosophy, at least insofar as these are meditated to him through Latin sources. In an intelligible sense, Augustine forms the turning point from which the historian can date the beginning of the medieval Christianations of political thought. Second, he develops a comprehensive critique of the moral and political tradition of imperial Rome. He deconstructs the ideology of Rome as the eternal city whose peace and justice are the peace and justice of the world. Third, and this perhaps is the main point, his idea form a clear and important stream of inspiration for political writers from the 9th to the 14th centuries. The doctrine of the 2 cities, much misunderstood and misrepresented, but importantly so, the association of political power with sin and with all that is base, ignoble, and destructive in man, the idea of man's utter dependence upon divine grace as bestowed through the agency of the church. If he is to be anything more than a condemned sinner, the suggestion that the church might and should call upon secular rulers to assist her, All these things are to take their place alongside the other familiar themes of medieval political controversy. As Augustine wishes the terms to be understood, a people and therefore a commonwealth cannot be truly such unless, in addition to whatever legal or social bond it has, it is united by a common worship of the true God. Viewed in terms of the subsequent history of political thought, this is, to say the least, a rather pregnant idea. All right. That ends the introduction. I didn't think that we would get through that today. And and then we will begin book 1 next time. So until next time, keep your eyes on Jesus, brothers and sisters. Your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And let us embed the Word of God upon the tablets of our hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived.